So, I had the opportunity to look at Harvard's admissions data, which was sort of why I took
Yeah.
the case. And so, for me, a lot of the debate about affirmative action, um, it's not well formed
Hmm.
because universities hide their data. So, it'd be sort of like saying you're for a minimum wage,
Hmm.
but not knowing what the minimum wage is that you're talking about. So, you might be for a $15 minimum wage, but not a $50
Right.
minimum wage. So this gave me a chance to look at how Harvard's policies were constructed. And the interesting thing about Harvard, which is sort of in my view, only loosely connected to affirmative action,
Hmm.
was the claim of discrimination against Asian American applicants
Mm.
relative to white applicants. So that, in principle, the judge could have ruled that we're going to keep affirmative action, but you can't just um, do it for whites.
Hmm.
You've got to at least have a level playing field for Asian American students relative to white students. Um, you at the district court level, they of course ruled against Students for Fair Admissions, which was the group that hired me.
Hmm.
And then at the Supreme Court level, uh, that flipped. So,
Mm.
this was the first past year where we're under the new regime, um, where you're not supposed to be using race in admissions.
Yeah, so I attended CSU Long Beach, which is moderately selective in the CSU system. Not is it's no Harvard, but how do you think it affects other universities as well that are not like Ivy Leagues? Is affirmative action also taking place in other universities that are less selective?
They are, but there are plenty of schools that are not selective,
Mhm.
and that so it always comes at the expense of some other school. So if
Mhm.
you get rid of affirmative action, it has very little effect on how many minority students go to college, but it affects where they go to college.
Mm.
And so, basically, diversity at Harvard comes at the expense of diversity at the next tier down.
Mm.
Diversity at the next tier down comes at the expense of the next tier after that, and so on.
Yeah, because something that you talk about is that you have students get into Harvard that they are bright students after all, but they're not up to the standards that Harvard requires, so they kind of get left behind everyone else. So that also happens in other schools as well. That the standards for certain races are different among themselves, right?
Uh, that's right, and it's very awkward to talk about
Hmm.
uh, because it gives people an excuse
Hmm.
to sort of say uh, to be prejudiced in some sense,
Hmm.
because they'll say, uh, you know, somebody who got in without affirmative action, that they must have got in with it,
Yeah.
Uh, and then the flip side of that is it can change your perspective as well if you think that the preferences were small, but the preferences were big,
Hmm.
and now you're struggling. Then it's sort of what do I make of this experience? Is it something about me, or is this place really sort of hostile to people like me?
Hmm.
And that creates tension. And I think it's interesting because like the Supreme Court rulings prior to this case,
Yeah.
they had ones in Michigan. What they ruled in the Michigan cases was that you can't use race as part of a point system,
Mm.
but you can use race holistically. And what that means is like you can use race as long as you hide it, how much you're doing it.
Yeah.
But if you had a point system, at least everyone knows how much of a benefit there is. And then, we're not going to say that it's more than that. We're not going to say that it's less than that.
Mhm.
Everyone sort of understands, how the system works. I would prefer that if we were going to have racial preferences, that it just be explicit
Mhm.
rather than hidden.
Yeah, because this is definitely a topic that a lot of people get uncomfortable talking about because we're living in a time that if you say something that's not politically correct, you could be labeled a racist. When it comes down to it, we're trying to figure out what's really going on because not only are we seeing it in affirmative action, but we're also seeing it in DEI. And the U.S. Appeals Court just rejected the Nasdaq. What is it? The diversity board, right?
Wow, I actually have not been following the case, but that's super interesting that they did. So sort of mandated number of seats for particular members. Is that right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so that happened, and what we're seeing is that a lot of companies are rolling back their DEI initiatives. So as we see with affirmative action and DEI, you know, I I, I want to say that the people that are behind it, have good intentions, but having good intentions is not really what matters. Is like, is it effective or not? Are the people that it's supposed to benefit are actually benefiting from this? And from what you've discussed is that you put people into situations that they are actually not adequate for because although they're brilliant people, they're not meeting the standards of of their peers. And to me it's very interesting, but it's hard to talk about because you don't want to be labeled a racist or a bigot just for talking about certain things that are actually going on. But
Well, and it's hard because if you want that group to succeed,
mhm,
if you want all students to succeed, you have to have those conversations.
right.
But people don't want to run the risk
Hmm.
that they say something wrong um, in exploring solutions. And to me, the reason that the DI thing is falling apart is because people were so afraid to actually look at the empirical evidence to try
Hmm.
to figure out what works. Even by looking at it, that was considered uh, racist. Like,
Hmm.
because saying I'd like to see some proof because I want to help, you know, that would be considered uh, not okay because we already know what the answer is, and that's a lot of that stuff was based on assertions rather
Hmm.
than on evidence.